Good afternoon, and welcome to the Institute of International Studies for today's panel on security opportunities and challenges in the Taiwan Strait. I'd first like to thank all of you for joining us. We have more than 200 people attending today's online event, and it's a real pleasure for us to be able to address such a large audience. My name is Daniel Sargent, and I'm an associate professor in history and at the Goldman School of Public Policy, and I'm also co-director of the Institute of International Studies, one of the sponsors of today's event. IIS is co-sponsoring today's panel with the Institute of East Asian Studies, the Center for Chinese Studies, and the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office of San Francisco. Before we begin, I'd like first to acknowledge those individuals who've helped to make today's event possible. Kevin O'Brien, the director of the Institute of East Asian Studies. Dylan Davis, the associate director of IEAS. Skye Van Valkenburg at IEAS. Susan Hyde, my co-director of the Institute of International Studies, and Claudia Gay at IIS. Today's panel is going to focus on the military and security situation in the Taiwan Strait. The topic is both urgent and timely. After all, the past decade has witnessed significant changes in the balance of military forces in the Taiwan Strait. The Chinese People's Liberation Army today commands what the US Department of Defense has called the world's largest navy, a battle force that includes approximately 350 ships and submarines. China's Eastern Theater Command has conducted major military exercises, including preparations for amphibious landings across the Taiwan Strait. Earlier this month, Admiral Philip Davidson testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee to the effect that the People's Republic of China is capable of both attempting and accomplishing the military conquest of Taiwan within the next 6 years. Meanwhile, diplomatic relations between both the People's Republic of China and Taiwan and the United States and the People's Republic of China have deteriorated appreciably in recent years, especially since the coming to power of Tsai Ing-wen's Democratic Progressive Party in January 2016 and the election of Donald Trump as US president later that year. Since January 2021, the inauguration of President Biden has perhaps produced subtle changes in US rhetoric on Taiwan issues, but the situation in the Taiwan Strait remains volatile and dangerous. Serious analysts are today comparing the military situation in the Taiwan Strait to the situation in Europe before the First World War, an analogy that Bob Blackwell and Philip Zelikow made in a recent report for the Council on Foreign Relations. So what should we think of this situation? How serious are the risks of armed conflict, even of a war that might draw in the United States? We are fortunate today to have a panel of distinguished experts in Taiwan and Asia-Pacific security issues, and we can look forward to them illuminating us with their experience and their wisdom. So let me introduce today's distinguished panel. First, Bonnie Glaser is director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She was previously a senior advisor for Asia and director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. She is a graduate of both Boston University and of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and she has extensive experience in US government agencies. She has worked as a consultant with both the Department of State and the Department of Defense. And the China Power Project that she created today provides a significant sort of measurable metrics of China's geopolitical capabilities. It represents a major contribution to the national debate on US-China relations and on China's geopolitical capabilities more broadly. Next, let me introduce Vice Admiral Robert Thomas, who is a professor of practice at the School of Public Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. But Admiral Thomas is also, and perhaps most importantly, a graduate of the University of California, Berkeley, where he earned his Bachelor of Science degree in civil engineering. After graduating from Berkeley, he pursued a 38-year career in the United States Navy, where he specialized as a submarine commander. His final operational assignment was as the commander of United States 7th Fleet, a command that envelops the Asia-Pacific region and the Eastern Indian Ocean. So he has significant experience of high-ranking military command with which to illuminate us today. And finally, let me introduce Major Gary Sampson, who is a PhD candidate at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and a Marine Corps officer who is presently serving as both a speechwriter and special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Major Sampson has previously served tours of duty in both Afghanistan and Iraq. A graduate of the University of Nebraska, where he earned his bachelor's degree, Major Sampson is also a graduate of the National Sun Yat-sen University, where he earned a Master's of Social Science degree in China and Asia-Pacific Studies. A specialist in Northeast Asia security affairs, his writings have appeared in a range of prestigious venues. Before we hear from our panel, though, let me just introduce for the audience some housekeeping issues for today's session. First, let me note that we are going to hear from our speakers in the following sequence. We're first going to hear from Gary Sampson, then we will hear from Bonnie Glaser, and then we'll hear from Robert Thomas. The speakers will have around 10 minutes each to speak, after which we will open for discussion. With all of that out of the way, let me turn the microphone and the screen to our first panelist, who will be Gary Sampson. Gary, over to you.
Okay, thanks Daniel so much for that very generous and kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to be appearing on this panel with such distinguished experts on Northeast Asian security. I'm really looking forward to the dialogue today. But before we get started, I would like to just throw in the disclaimer. So you mentioned that I'm an active duty U.S. military officer, that's correct. But everything I'm going to say here today reflects just my personal views and in no way represents the official position of the U.S. Marine Corps, Department of the Navy, Department of Defense, or any other part of the U.S. government. So for my time today, I'm going to talk about three things. First, how I came to learn about Taiwan. Then I'll look at a comparison of Taiwan's situation around 10 years ago when I was studying there as a graduate student, and fast forward then to today and take a look at what's changed and how things are going for Taiwan security-wise. And this is where we're going to talk about some of the security challenges that are the focus of this panel. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I think may be opportunities for Taiwan in the current situation to address some of the security challenges that are going on. But first, I'd like to take just a moment to talk about how I started studying Taiwan and learning about Taiwan. And it was through a unique leadership development program available to U.S. military officers called the Olmsted Scholar Program. And this program is the flagship program of the George and Carol Olmsted Foundation. And it provides young officers a chance to study overseas in a foreign university, preferably in as much as possible taught in foreign language they learned before they head over there. And it just gives them a chance to live overseas with their families, or if they don't have families, but to immerse in the culture and learn that foreign language and be a graduate student and travel throughout the region. And so that's what I did. And it's available to all the services, including our newest service, the Space Force, for the Coast Guard. Everyone has a chance to do it in the military. And from the Space Force, we actually have a few notable folks. Colonel Mike Hopkins, who's an astronaut currently, NASA astronaut. And we have also General David Thompson, who's the Vice Chief of Space Operations currently. So we have very good representatives in the Space Force, our newest military service. And as Daniel mentioned, I started my learning about Taiwan really as a part of this program where I studied, as he mentioned, at National Sun Yat-sen University. And so that's where I'll pick things up then as I studied there from 2009 to 11. And as we look back to what things were like then, a very quite different scenario going on. If you look across the strait, of course, at that time, it was before Xi Jinping came to power. One belt, one road was still a figment of his imagination at that time. I remember arriving in Taiwan and being really surprised by the degree of what I'll refer to as détente that seemed to be in the air. It wasn't what I really expected going there. And there were so many indicators at that time that Taiwan and China were coming closer. At that time, Ma Ying-jeou was president, Ma Ying-jeou of KMT, president of Taiwan, and they were taking a lot of actions to draw closer economically and with all sorts of different links that were being expanded across the Taiwan Strait. And one of the big things that a lot of folks were talking about around that time was the ECFA, the Economic Cooperation and Framework Agreement. And it provided tariff concessions and open markets in China, in nearly a dozen sectors to business persons in Taiwan. And it really, I think, expanded what Taiwan is able to do economically, market-wise. At that time, trade between China and Taiwan was valued around 110 billion. And Taiwan, I think, hoped by signing the ECFA agreement, it would open basically a greater latitude for Taiwan to sign free trade agreements with other actors in the region, such as ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or Singapore, basically open up some options to them that hadn't been available previously. These were efforts that were later blocked by China. And not everyone was on board with what the opening that was going on at that time. And obviously, there's an opposition party in Taiwan at that time, the DPP, and they were not necessarily on board with this. They had a different idea about Taiwan's path. But President Ma was able to win a comfortable re-election to a second term. And then, as I was mentioned earlier, that took Taiwan through 2016. So shifting gears to diplomatically, Taiwan and China at that time were under conditions of what some refer to as a diplomatic truce. The competition between Beijing and Taipei for official recognition from partners had kind of ceased at that time. And I think that the number of countries that had recognized Taiwan officially at that time was around 22, which maybe doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it's more than it is currently, which I'll mention that number later. But basically, since that time, since 2016, when the administration changed in Taiwan and things started picking up in terms of competition, that number has decreased. And also around 2009 was the first time that a majority of people in Taiwan held a separate identity as Taiwanese, separate from Chinese. And this was a change from generations of folks who'd grown up in Taiwan and thought of themselves as both Taiwanese and Chinese. But around this time, the majorities started to think of themselves mainly as Taiwanese. And security, even at that time, was a bit of a grim area. Beijing had been pursuing rapid military modernization for quite a while, even at that point. And studies that were taking place at that time reflected that the balance had shifted across the strait, whereas Taiwan perhaps earlier had been able to maybe be close to on par with what the PLA would be able to bring to bear. Things were starting to shift around this time, and a lot of questions were coming up. And internally in Taiwan with their defense, I remember a big issue amongst my classmates and colleagues there is that they were shifting from a conscription-based military at that time to trying to put it into place an all-volunteer force, and they were looking for help with that from the U.S. military, who obviously we've been an all-volunteer force for decades by that time. But soon after this period, 2009-ish to 2011, Xi Jinping came to power and things started to change. He took a different approach to build up power for China, and things really began to change later as the administrations changed in Taiwan, as Daniel mentioned earlier, 2016, and then as there was administration change also in the United States later that year, and then President Trump administration came in. And so as a result of some of these things, the diplomatic competition between China and Taiwan resumed. And since then, several other countries have shifted recognition from Taipei to Beijing. And so now just 15 countries maintain formal relations with Taiwan. Economically, Taiwan remains very robust. It's among the 20 largest economies in the world. That trade that I mentioned between China and Taiwan has grown since in the past decade, to where it's now worth around $150 billion annually, representing approximately 1/3 of Taiwan's total trade. And China is Taiwan's largest trading partner, giving them some leverage. One area that's, I think, maybe an area of strength for Taiwan in this realm is semiconductors. And this is an area, I think, where China is trying to catch up, perhaps are a couple of generations behind where the cutting edge research in Taiwan is at currently. So that could be an area where Beijing is looking for not only to settle the score or finish the business of the Chinese Civil War, but also to gain access to some of these cutting edge semiconductor technologies. And militarily, I think, is probably the area that a lot of folks are seeing a lot of indicators these days of things not going as well for Taiwan. There's routine interdictions of Chinese aircraft into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Beijing continues to field what's been referred to, I think, as the world's largest navy. Just over this past weekend, Xi Jinping participated in the commissioning of 3 additional PLA Navy vessels, including one amphibious ship that I think is on par essentially with some of the largest such ships that the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps currently field. And I think Taiwan internally, in terms of their forces, really are continuing to struggle with transition from a conscription-based force to all-volunteer force, readiness issues, and just being able to spend enough to provide for their defense. And so I think they're continuing to struggle to adjust to these new challenges. And so briefly, I just want to mention, I think, where Taiwan might be able to have a comparative advantage in the face of all these security challenges that are, it's facing today. And I think that's in the area, one of the areas I haven't mentioned much previously, but it's in information. And this is basically in terms of reputation, where, Taiwan was able to have, for instance, a very successful campaign against COVID. And this is something I think I learned a lot of lessons from the SARS epidemic or crisis of about 2 decades ago, and we were able to put it into practice very effectively as COVID came into bear, and just were able to serve as a great example of kind of how to do things right in response to COVID. And so I think that's an area that obviously Taiwan, I think, has shown that and promoted itself as having done that. But another area where I think it can continue to bolster its reputation. And I just don't think there's a lot of options for Taiwan to compete symmetrically with China today. Obviously, in terms of the military, I think that's a foregone conclusion. If Taiwan's having to fight China on its own, it's going to be a bad day for Taiwan, I think, pretty much across the board. But asymmetrically, I think there's still some options available to them. And I think a lot of it revolves around telling the story of Taiwan, telling the story of the successes that it's had over decades, kind of as it's had its space to grow and mature as a democracy and as a market-based economy, and just to being able to bolster its stature in with regard to international organizations and those remaining countries that have formal relations with it. And so I'll go ahead and stop there. I'm a little bit over my 10 minutes, but I look forward to engaging with my fellow panel members as we move forward, and then also with the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're going to hear next from Bonnie.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me today to join in this very important discussion. I want to start out just by saying very briefly why I think Taiwan matters to the United States. It is a democracy, the only real Chinese democracy, and stands as a model for the people of mainland China to see that a Chinese democracy can be successful. Taiwan shares our values. It is a key, as Gary just noted, in IT supply chains, especially semiconductors. And it's really closely watched by our allies as a test of U.S. credibility. We don't have treaty commitments to Taiwan as we have to other allies in the region, like Japan and South Korea and Australia. But if China were to attack Taiwan and the United States did not come to Taiwan's defense, I think that our allies potentially would factor that into their own strategies and policy decision-making. That would end up setting in motion a series of developments that would weaken U.S. influence in the region. The United States has an interest in preventing the use of force, the use of coercion to compel the people of Taiwan to concede to PRC demands. And it has, I think there's a growing concern in the United States and elsewhere about whether China is poised to use force or even to invade Taiwan. And at the beginning, Daniel, you referenced Admiral Davidson's remarks, which were made in front of Congress, that the PLA could decide to take Taiwan within the next 6 years. There is growing concern about the erosion of deterrence in the Taiwan Strait because of growing Chinese capabilities. And I'm going to leave Admiral Thomas to focus on that issue, given his vast expertise. But I do want to note that the military factors are critical, but of course are not the only factors that we need to consider when we assess the potential for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So I have written extensively about this subject, and I essentially see China as engaged in psychological warfare and intimidation against Taiwan. For Beijing, Taiwan is a political problem, much more, or at least first and foremost, and secondarily, a military problem. China has long used gray zone tactics to wear down Taiwan's confidence and to deter independence. And China's toolkit, it's of gray zone tactics, that is, capabilities that are under the threshold that would trigger a military response from the United States. This toolkit, military, diplomatic, and economic levers, is really expanding and therefore is posing greater threats to Taiwan, threats of isolation and harming Taiwan's economic prosperity. But in my view, even if the PLA has the capability or will soon have the capability to seize and control Taiwan, which I believe it does not have, I think it's important to note that China will not simply invade because it can. I mean, the costs are simply quite high. And if you're sitting in Zhongnanhai, which is the center of where the Chinese leadership lives and works, you have to take into consideration many other factors. One is the risk of failure, the implications of failure for the legitimacy of Chinese Communist Party rule and for Xi Jinping's own status as the general secretary of the party and the leader of the military. There's a risk of major war with the United States, and China is not ready to engage in a major war with the United States. And if it did, it would, of course, pay a huge cost. And this includes a setback in Xi Jinping's really ambitious domestic agenda. Xi Jinping has set out goals for 2035 and 2049 to modernize the military by 2035, by 2049, which is the 100th centenary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. Xi Jinping wants China to have a first-tier military, really to have a military that's a peer with the United States. Other goals include dominating technology, key strategic technologies of the 21st century, and making China more self-reliant and having greater soft power. So all of these goals would be set back if there were a war with the United States. I also want to make the point that China's urgent and top priority regarding Taiwan is to prevent Taiwan from declaring independence. It is not to achieve reunification in the near term. Of course, that's a longer term goal, but Xi Jinping has not shown urgency to achieve reunification now again and put all these other things at risk. Taiwan is an issue that the Chinese Communist Party sees ultimately as a threat to its own legitimacy, but not an opportunity to be seized. And that has meant that the Chinese Communist Party policy toward Taiwan is really about what it wants to avoid, not what it wants to achieve. So it's about avoiding separation. Xi Jinping has said, of course, that he wants to reunify Taiwan. Every leader of China has said this. Once Xi Jinping said, actually twice, that the problems between Taiwan and mainland China should not be passed down from one generation to another. And I would argue that that perhaps shows some impatience, but not urgency. Xi Jinping was recently in Fujian province, which is just opposite Taiwan. And he actually made statements about promoting economic integration with Taiwan. He didn't visit a frontline PLA unit and make bellicose statements about the need for reunification in the near term. And it's also worth noting the 14th five-year plan, which was just issued by China last month, reaffirms the policy guideline of pursuing peaceful development across the Taiwan Strait. So I would argue that China's ultimate objective is not invasion, it's to start a process between Chinese and Taiwanese authorities to negotiate the political relationship between the two sides. Ultimately, it wants to achieve integration without military conflict. It is true that Chinese confidence in being able to achieve unification is eroding. Public opinion polls in Taiwan show that a very tiny percentage of people support unification. This is in large part because of the life in China, the authoritarian policies, the lack of access to the internet, and the freedoms that the people of Taiwan have largely grown up with as younger people become old enough to vote and can have an input into the decision making. But I would say that even though the Chinese may be losing confidence in the ability to achieve unification, they haven't concluded that the existing policy has failed. That could happen in the years to come. And if PLA capabilities continue to grow, and at the same time, the Chinese Communist Party concludes that it's unable to achieve reunification peacefully, that could be a very worrisome and dangerous moment. And so I think that's something we have to worry about. Finally, I'll just say that I do believe China has red lines, but I think that the US and Taiwan are unlikely to cross them. So if the United States were actually to deploy forces on Taiwan, or if Taiwan were actually to declare independence or hold a referendum on independence, I think perhaps Xi Jinping could be backed into a corner, and then ultimately he may have to use force, even though he would not want to put at risk these other goals I talked about earlier. But I have, as I said, confidence that the United States and Taiwan are quite clear about these red lines. We have a very cautious and prudent leader today in Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, who has been very consistent in supporting the preservation of the status quo, certainly as Taiwan defines it, but preservation of the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. So I very much look forward to the rest of the discussion and turn the floor back to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Bonnie. And it's now sort of my pleasure to turn the microphone to Admiral Robert Thomas.
Okay, great. Thanks, Daniel. And so if Sky could just put up that quick slide, I think we'll use that as a reference or a point of departure for discussion based on my colleagues. They've set the scene perfectly. If I have a disagreement, it will be absolutely on the margins. But I'll take more of a mechanic's view with respect to opportunities and challenges in the Taiwan Strait. Somewhat influenced, interestingly, by some of my grad students here at UC San Diego, who are from Taiwan and now are there in government and non-governmental positions. But first, and this is typical, as Daniel mentioned, engineering grad from Berkeley. So I'm going to get into the kind of the mechanics of maritime geography. You look at the Taiwan Strait, and it's by any definition, including UNCLOS. And interestingly enough, we should probably talk about that during the question and answer period. I have some militant views about why we are not signed up to UNCLOS, that ratification, which I think we absolutely should be. But that said, the maritime geography is rather interesting. It's about 130 kilometers at its narrowest point, about 180 kilometers at its widest point. The entire Taiwan Strait sits on the Asian continental shelf. So nominally 50 meters deep, acoustically. Remember, you're talking to a longtime submariner, so acoustically, it's chaos with the shipping and the fishing that goes on in the Taiwan Strait. It is acoustically very, very noisy. And then you see that blue shaded area down there southwest of the Penghu's and west of Kaohsiung. That is known as the Taiwan Banks. That's a shoal area. And so the reason I'm setting this up is, and I couldn't agree more. I think Bonnie and Gary both have laid out a great argument for, hey, a military operation across the Taiwan Straits, extremely unlikely. But if it was to happen, it's not only a tough move for the PLA, but it's also tough defensively for Taiwan, and we should probably talk about that. Maritime history. So it's not that a Taiwan crisis hasn't happened before. 1949, and then subsequently 50-51, Chairman Mao attempted to close the deal that Bonnie mentioned. And so that was rebuffed by the US Navy, in particular the 7th Fleet. It happened again in 96. Again, the 7th Fleet was there with 2 carrier strike groups, and that kind of ended that particular excursion, somewhat embarrassing for the PLA. And of course, they remember it to this day. In my exchanges, I went and visited the North Sea Fleet Commander, Admiral Ewan, back in 2014 in Qingdao. And then I went down and visited Admiral Shen, the South Sea Fleet Commander at the time, and now their Chief of Navy. And it's clear that they reminded me of that particular issue in the mid-90s. With that said, it seems like the title of this webinar is Challenges and Opportunities across the Taiwan Strait. And so one would ask, hey, is there a 4th Taiwan Strait crisis? Is it imminent? And I would agree with my panel members that it's not. And I go to this word patience, and Bonnie used the word urgency, but I think Xi has actually been very patient. He's given himself a lot of decision space. Of course, after the 19th Party Congress, he said, the succession plan, let's not worry about that. I've kind of signed myself up for head of the Communist Party for a long, long time. So he's got time to resolve the issue. The second issue is uncertainty. With the passing of the previous administration in the US, where you really kind of didn't know what you were going to get. President Trump sowed a lot of uncertainty with respect to the international system, including our allies, partners, and friends. And so if you're sitting in Beijing contemplating a military move, you just don't know what to expect. The Syrian case was a classic example. Capability and capacity. This is where I deviate from Admiral Davidson, Admiral Aquilino, who's the confirmed successor, perhaps from Bonnie and from Gary, maybe. I looked at it back when I was the 7th Fleet Commander, and my assessment was, they can actually make the move today. But the issue is the cost. So militarily, they now have the capability and the capacity to make this cross-strait move, or to make some subset of that move. But again, we've got to maybe tease out in the Q&A the why. Interestingly enough, back a little more than a week ago, the Hoover Institute, did a seminar on this very issue. Daniel, I think, mentioned the Council on Foreign Relations kind of report out on this issue. One of them was, one of the options was peripheral islands, but what does that gain the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party? gets them a lot of international admonition and not much of a gain. The second option they teased out was a naval blockade. Again, that really doesn't make much sense because it gives the potential adversaries, the US and anybody else that they could muster up to join, an opportunity to counterpunch in a way that's just cost imposition. And then they talked about, this swift military campaign against Taiwan itself. If that were the case today, my assessment, the PLA in all of its incarnations, again, remember that you also have to factor in the Chinese fishing fleet, the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia, the Air Force, the rocket forces. Gary mentioned information. So, legions of cyber warriors on, the mainland. Taiwan's in a really, really tough spot and won't last very long. In fact, I think they would acquiesce very simply, pretty early. Just defensively, a tough call for them if China went all in. There would be costs, but it's just not an equation that I can get my head around if I'm looking at it from the PLA leadership, which of course is absolutely loyal to the Chinese Communist Party and to Xi Jinping. So that gets us to where we are today. This is the other thing Xi's got going for him, is he's conducting this, what I call a readiness exhaustion campaign. Bonnie called it gray zone, and it's working very, very well. The ASEAN neighbors in the South China Sea are feeling the heat. Whitsun Reef is the latest episode for the Philippines to deal with. The Vietnamese are, across the breakers on this one too. Taiwan, you're seeing more and more. Gary mentioned the Air Defense Identification Zone, and although it doesn't have any legal standing, it forces Taiwan to respond, and if they don't, they are accepting a new status quo. Just north, up in the Ryukyus, of course, the Chinese are very, very active and kind of driving the Japanese into this, what I call a readiness exhaustion. And so if you're continuing to be successful with this, if you're continuing to accumulate advantage, and back to this issue of patience, I think that you just steady course and speed. The other side of this is I believe that the military balance has changed to the point where I think it was probably the case when I was the 7th Fleet Commander from 2013 to 2015. I probably just didn't want to admit it, but you're no longer able, if you're a U.S. Joint Force Commander, to interdict and conduct sea denial in any meaningful way in the Taiwan Strait. Those days are past. And so you're now forced from a military perspective to, all right, we will respond, we will react, but it's a counterpunch. It's cost imposition. General Mattis, my former boss and former SecDef, he talks about expanding the competitive space and avoiding the actual fight in the Taiwan Strait. And that's possible, but what it tells you is from a military balance perspective, the days of interdicting an amphibious assault across the Taiwan Strait, if the PLA and Plan AF is absolutely committed, those days are done in my view. So I'll kind of put a bow around it there, and I'm really looking forward to the questions. And again, I thought that both Gary and Bonnie really kind of closed the deal, and I'm just kind of adding some mechanical aspects to it. Thanks.
Thank you to all three of the panelists for three terrific presentations. There is an enormous amount here with which we can grapple. I am glad to report that questions from our audience are already flooding in over the transom. I have some questions of my own that I will throw into the mix, but let me first invite our panelists to offer any responses to each other that they would like to provide. It seemed to me that there were few areas of stark disagreement, but if you want to take the opportunity to challenge or correct anything that anybody else said. In that case, let me introduce my first audience question. And this is from Brad Diduka, who asks whether you might share your thoughts on whether you believe that the United States' one China policy and strategic ambiguity remain the best approach. Or, as Richard Haas has recently suggested, should the United States more clearly state its position? This seems to me like a crucial question that you addressed, the three of you, sort of obliquely, but it would be great to have a direct answer. Bonnie, are you going to speak to this?
I will start with that, Daniel. I was one of the three experts that was asked to write a response to Richard Haas when he advocated in foreign affairs to adopt a strategic clarity. So first, let me just explain what this means. Strategic ambiguity refers to the fact that the United States does not have a position in advance that it would, under all circumstances, come to Taiwan's defense. We had a treaty, a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan from 1954 through 1979. But when we established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, we broke that treaty. And now we have a Taiwan Relations Act, which mandates that the United States must sell defensive weapons and services to Taiwan. We have to keep a significant presence in the West Pacific, which is supposed to deter Chinese attack or coercion against Taiwan. But we do not have an obligation to come to Taiwan's defense. And one of the reasons why we have a strategic ambiguity is because it is believed and has been for quite some time by US presidents that there should be some flexibility that a president should have, and that we shouldn't give a blank check to Taiwan. So we actually should have dual deterrence. We should be deterring Taiwan from moving in a direction of independence, which at one point, Taiwan did have a DPP president, Chen Shui-bian, that did pursue some provocative actions that almost brought us into a crisis. This was during the George W. Bush administration. So the question is, should we change this posture of strategic ambiguity? And my view is no. And I would argue and have argued that strategic ambiguity and clarity shouldn't really be viewed so black and white. It's actually a spectrum. And our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, just said about a week ago that, that the use of force to change the status quo in the Taiwan Strait would be a mistake. And that's an example of a tougher declaratory statement that should be made by the United States that moves us along that spectrum towards strategic clarity without actually saying we will come to Taiwan's defense under all circumstances. Another reason why I think that strategic clarity is not in US interest is if the United States were to say tomorrow we will come to Taiwan's defense in all contingencies, then perhaps Xi Jinping might be provoked to attack. We are not certain about the role of Taiwan within Chinese politics. This is very much a black box. And Xi Jinping could be vulnerable on the issue of Taiwan. And by the way, we are on the verge of the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, the holding of the Chinese Olympics Beijing Olympics next year, and also a very important party Congress next year. And so I think we should not ignore the fact that we could make decisions that could affect Chinese politics and decision-making in a way that could be very damaging to our interests and to Taiwan's interests. So I think essentially this is a policy that has worked, There is no reason to fundamentally change it. But again, this is a spectrum, and we should be modifying both our military posture, our operations, as well as our declaratory statements and our other policies, diplomatic and economic, in order to strengthen deterrence.
Great, thank you. Robert, Gary, did either of you want to get in on that question?
Agree completely with Bonnie, and I would just put a little sharper point to it. I don't think the U.S. has a choice. Mm-hmm. Okay, we can talk about, hey, let's be very declaratory in our deterrence, but right now we would suffer a credibility gap as we look at doing public math with respect to military balance in Asia. And I think we would put, interestingly enough, our allies in a hard spot. You saw it last week, right after the summit with President Biden. Suga-san says, hey, by the way, the self-defense force with respect to Taiwan, that's a non-starter. And so this would be more, you'd put more pressure on our allies with that kind of declaratory policy. Thanks.
Thank you. I wanted to sort of take the opportunity to ask the three of you to probe a little deeper into what Bonnie just called sort of the black box of domestic politics. Since that black box seems, to me at least, like a significant driver of uncertainty in the Taiwan Strait situation. Of course, the reality is that there are at least three black boxes that are relevant to the situation. One is Chinese domestic politics, the next is Taiwanese domestic politics, and the third is US domestic politics. And we've spoken more, or at least Gary reflected in his remarks on Taiwanese domestic politics. But I would be sort of interested to hear the three of you reflect on US domestic politics and the question of whether so the turn towards a more hawkish, China policy, which has been sort of, widely, remarked upon in U.S. Domestic politics, is now becoming a significant driver of uncertainty in its own right. Should we be concerned about the rhetoric on Capitol Hill? Should we be concerned about sort of the hawkish, tenor of analyses, coming out of, venues like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Hoover Institution? Is this discourse a source of uncertainty in the situation?
Hey, Daniel, let me go ahead and just provide a point of departure for Bonnie and Gary. And this is going to sound counterintuitive, and I apologize up front because people are going to go, okay, Robert Thomas has lost his mind. He's been down at UC San Diego in the sun far too long. But there's really two vectors involved right now. So you have the current administration, which has clearly, rejoined in all the traditional senses the international system with multilateralism and those kinds of things. Now, it's pretty hard to walk back, the campaign rhetoric of the candidate Biden when he calls Xi Jinping a thug. Okay, got it. It's also difficult when Tony Blinken signs up to, Western China, Uyghurs, genocide. Okay, but the flip side is, hey, we just finished getting together on, kind of rejoining the Paris Accords, talking to China about meaningful goals in climate change, those kinds of things. So there are some areas for cooperation. And it sounds like, I am sounding very much like the now host of the Northeast Asia Cooperation Dialogue. I just inherited that from Susan Shirk, a colleague down here at UCSD. But I think the domestic politics piece and this, quote, hawkish rhetoric is also somewhat mitigated by action. actual diplomatic action and kind of strengthening the U.S. position in the international system. So I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank
you. Maybe I'll just jump in briefly and challenge your question a bit, Daniel. I don't see U.S. policy as uncertain. I see us as engaged in a healthy process that democracies engage in, debates to assess what the challenges are that we face. This really did, I think, gain momentum during the Trump administration, and the Biden administration actually shares many of the assessments that the Trump administration had about the challenges that China poses to the United States. And the Biden administration is currently working through all of these things that it inherited to figure out what it wants to keep or revise or perhaps not continue. But I would agree with you on one point, and that is that Congress is in fact playing a healthy role, but can in some ways play an unhealthy role. So when a member of Congress tries to attack the president as being soft on China for political reasons, but it's not grounded in the facts, I actually think that that's unhelpful. But the current there's several pieces of legislation that are under consideration right now that I think are extremely important. One is the Strategic Competition Act of 2021, and another is the Endless Frontier Act. And that latter one is really aimed at advancing innovation and technology in the United States and research so that we can maintain our cutting edge in the strategic technologies of the 21st century. These are areas where China has already set out timelines for it to become dominant in, and is seen by Xi Jinping as indispensable for achieving the goals that he has set out for China in 2035 and 2049. So I think that U.S. policy is still being formulated. We are still developing strategies to cope with some of these challenges, but I think this is a really healthy process. And we and Taiwan are not the black box that China is, just to make a point about that. We're very actually transparent systems.
No, I guess we're a Pandora's box, not a black box. But I have a question about Taiwanese domestic politics, which I'm going to direct to Gary, if that's okay. And this is an audience question. And the question reads, with Tsai Ing-wen's victory in 2016, Beijing seems to have given up on offering carrots. Since the KMT seems unlikely to pull itself together in time for success in the 2024 election, do we have any signs that Beijing is ready to work with the DPP government? Will Tsai Ing-wen's successes be as pragmatic as she has been?
Thank you, Daniel. I guess from my fighting hole, so to speak, I don't see a lot of evidence that Beijing is ready to step forward with carrots and how it's dealing with Taiwan. I agree with a lot of what's been said so far by my fellow panelists in terms of time kind of being on the side of China as they go through this. They have kind of the space that they need to. They don't have to be. It's not an urgent issue. They have, I think, Taiwan kind of on the ropes or boxed into a corner, diplomatically and through further economic integration with them. I think they exert greater and greater influence over Taiwan and the decision space they have for various approaches and policies becomes smaller and smaller, and eventually, trending towards moving in the direction that Beijing wants to a greater extent, I think. So I guess right now I don't see a prospect for moving towards carrots to be offered by Beijing anytime soon.
Great, thank you. I have a couple of audience questions that deal with sort of economic issues as they relate to the Taiwan Strait situation. A question here from James Lin of the University of Washington. Does U.S. reliance on Taiwan's semiconductor industry change the calculus for U.S. decision makers regarding U.S.-China-Taiwan relations? And this is my commentary, but insofar as COVID has made us acutely aware of the vulnerabilities that accompany transnational supply chains, this seems like a really sort of salient and urgent question.
All right, I'd be happy to kick off on this one. Taiwan plays a very leading role in our IT supply chains, and particularly semiconductors. And Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC, is the leading foundry fabricator of chips in the world. It is, in fact, now establishing a plant in the United States, and I believe it's in Arizona. And it will be actually bringing some smaller companies with it. In other words, creating sort of what we call a cluster or an ecosystem that will support some of its chip manufacturing here. Its most advanced chips, however, are going to be produced in Taiwan. So the next generation of the 5 nanometer chips are going to be produced. I believe it's in Tainan, in southern Taiwan. But of course, TSMC does a lot of business with mainland China, and so it's squeezed. It's caught in the middle. China wants to buy chips from TSMC, but TSMC is, as I understand, abiding by U.S. law when we have implemented restrictions. So they have been curbing their exports to China, which has resulted, of course, in automobile companies having difficulty getting access to chips, and TSMC hasn't been producing as many or selling. So this has reverberations throughout industries, is my point. And this is something that the United States, I know, is quite mindful of. One of the things that was started under the Trump administration was bilateral talks with Taiwan on supply chains. This includes medical supplies as well as semiconductors and perhaps a few other areas. And I think this is a good development. That this is a way that we can ensure that Taiwan becomes more integrated, more networked into like-minded democracies around the world. But it is a risk that the United States takes in being dependent on TSMC. But let's be clear, we made decisions years ago that have left us lagging behind in various aspects of semiconductor production. We are not going to regain our lead by ourselves in a very short period of time. So I think what we need to do is to just secure these supply chains with like-minded, trusted countries. And I think Taiwan is one of them.
Great. I'm going to introduce another audience question as a follow-up. Does sort of Taiwan's dependence on transnational supply chains create a source of vulnerability to Chinese economic coercion? Our question asks whether Beijing might, make threatening moves that could make outside investors so nervous about a potential Taiwan Strait crisis that they would start pulling out capital from Taiwan. I think we conventionally think about Taiwan's sort of integration into global value chains as a source of strength and resilience for Taiwan. But this question sort of rather ingeniously asks us to consider the reverse, that Taiwan's economic interdependence might in fact be a source of vulnerability.
So I think this, in some respects, ties back to the idea of gray zone tactics. I think there's a lot of things that in the kind of the context of this question, where you're looking at, imported goods or, whatever it is coming into Taiwan and the ability to possibly cut those off. It doesn't have to go to the extent of, creating a, quarantine or maritime blockade. I think there's things that China could do well short of that, much less provocative, that might net some of the same goals or results, putting pressure on specific companies or threatening access to the China market for these various companies if they don't do certain things, cut back or reduce their trade on certain things with Taiwan. Or I think there's a lot of things that they could do, and it doesn't. I think it's definitely possibly a growing vulnerability that could affect Taiwan. I don't have a great answer for it, but I think it's a concern for sure.
Hey, Daniel, just to follow up on Gary's point, there's another, I guess we would call it a gray zone tactic. So I, of course, am sitting here at a very large public research university, just as you are, Daniel. And the amount of Chinese money in research in the US, the amount of Chinese influence at the university level, the effort by the People's Republic of China to emulate US university research foundational elements within China. As I talk to my academic colleagues at places like Nanking University or Renmin University, it's clear that they could exert pressure off axis with respect to Taiwan right here in the United States. And we've seen it before when they react badly to something that they consider provocative. A classic example was Chancellor Khosla a few years ago here at UCSD invited the Dalai Lama to be the graduate speaker. So you start doing the math on that, and all the Chinese students, of course, took a pass, and the people who are responsible for monitoring Chinese students, here in the U.S. got very excited. And UCSD just did a quick calculation, and it was millions of dollars that went out the door with that particular decision. And so there's another inroad with respect to kind of a stick. And you see it time and time again from the PRC. When they don't like something, they take it out economically on somebody. South Korea is another classic example with the THAAD deployment, and so on and so on. So I think there's plenty of opportunities for them to exert pressure off axis in this regard.
Great, thank you. I have a number of questions about military capabilities on both sides, which I would like to turn to. But let me first pose a really interesting question from Sean Connolly about sort of the role that mainland Chinese working in Taiwan and Taiwanese living and working in the mainland may have to play in the conflict. The question sort of invites us to consider whether sort of the presence of mainland populations on Taiwan and the reverse constitutes any sort of deterrent against military action by the PLA. And the question also asks, as a sort of follow-up point, whether emigre communities might offer any meaningful political voice as a constituency within their respective domestic governments.
Well, I'm happy to take a stab at it. There's over 1 million Taiwanese living in mainland China. There are not that many people from the mainland living in Taiwan. There used to be, on any given day, a significant number of tourists, but Beijing has curtailed the flow of tourists to Taiwan. There are some students, but not that many. Again, Beijing is discouraging students from mainland China from going to Taiwan. Importantly, of course, there are expatriates who are living in Taiwan. There's a large number of Americans. I don't know off the top of my head what it is, but also a large number of Japanese who live in Taiwan. And I don't know if that would factor into a PLA decision or the decision of Beijing, I should say, to employ the PLA to deploy them to use force against Taiwan. But that should be a factor in my view. So I think that this is among the many things that the Chinese would have to take into account if they were to use force against Taiwan.
Great, thank you. Let's sort of open up a larger regional perspective, if we might. TJ Pempel of the Political Science Department here at Berkeley has asked you to reflect upon how Taiwan Strait issues can be shaped by other powers in the region, in particular by Japan, but also by the ASEAN countries.
So I will, in the interest of full transparency, TJ is one of my mentors. And so hidden in that question, and again, with TJ's expertise, especially with respect to the Japanese, I think that any deterrent effect militarily with respect to support for Taiwan, if people, and it doesn't matter really kind of what their perspective is, where they're coming from, if they don't understand the centrality of Japan in that formula, I think from a military perspective, they're going to find themselves wanting. For the U.S., again, extremely unlikely that you're in a force-on-force major combat operation in the vicinity of Taiwan. But if you found yourself there and you did not have the full support of the Japanese self-defense force and the logistics capability and so on, and be able to operate out of those UN bases and joint bases in Japan, then it would be folly on the U.S. military's point. I'll leave it there.
If I could just jump in and add to the military factors that Admiral Thomas pointed out that are really important, but of course our allies and partners can do more in other areas, and diplomacy in economic areas are really important. So for example, Australia had been negotiating or had the intention to negotiate with Taiwan a free trade agreement once it signed a free trade agreement with China, but didn't follow through on that. Japan could also begin negotiations for a free trade agreement. Taiwan's a very important economic partner for Japan. EU could be negotiating an investment agreement. On the diplomacy side, supporting Taiwan's participation in the international community, the World Health Organization front and center, but others as well. And I would also highlight there's this not very well-known project that the United States started with Taiwan called the Global Cooperation Training Framework, where we hold these workshops so that Taiwan can showcase and share its expertise with officials from countries started around the region, but now it's been internationalized, so it's now worldwide. And Japan is now a full partner in this program. Sweden and the UK have also co-sponsored some of the workshops. And this enables countries to learn from Taiwan's experience in global health and media literacy and women's empowerment, all sorts of areas. So this is an area that's not terribly provocative to Beijing, but really important in easing Taiwan's isolation and promoting its integration into the world.
Well, that I think is a good entree to another question that we have from the audience. And this question asks us to consider a much more provocative scenario. And now I'm just going to read the question directly. Do you believe that the United States should seek to develop pre-planned military response options with regional partners such as Japan or the Quad? Or do you think that this would prove overly provocative to China?
All right. Well, I'll take a stab at this, at least to provide a point of departure. I think that informally, those discussions have probably taken place. To do any formal planning, given all four of those, the members of the Quad, given their inability to stay quiet and do anything in a clandestine fashion, as opposed to seeing it below the fold on the front page of the Washington Post, is probably suspect. So I would kind of shy away from it, other than very informally. In fact, one of the methods you could use, and this is, I'm not volunteering, is something that the U.S. has done for many, many years, and that is use your former military types and others, especially in the academic world, that can talk to planning, can talk to organization, can talk to the training and equipment issues that would be involved in real contingency planning for a Taiwan major combat operation. But again, extremely unlikely. And I think if you made it public, it would be very controversial. So I'll leave it at that.
I think, so I would say, the direct answer to that is no, and for the reasons I agree with what Evan Thomas said, but I think what could be done in the absence of that is you can work on increasing interoperability of forces, well below kind of the threshold of, creating formal military plans. And so, I think that would make sense. A prudent measure would be for the U.S. and other, allies and partners in the Quad or other formulations. That should be ongoing, I think, as a way to kind of strengthen capability, regardless of what future courses of action are chosen militarily.
Great, thank you. Let me now sort of segue to a series of questions that have to do with the military balance in the Taiwan Strait. And a number of these questions sort of push at the larger question of asymmetric deterrence and what, in particular, Taiwanese, fighting forces might be capable of mustering. Our first question is from Karis Templeman, who asks us to ponder the question. Some US analysts have argued that Taiwan is still defensible even in the face of a fully modernized PLA, and that the Taiwanese themselves could do a lot more to make the cost and risk of an invasion unacceptably high. Panelists, do you agree or disagree? And what can the Taiwanese themselves do to maximize asymmetric advantages against the PLA?
One of the things they could do is stop buying things from the US that aren't helpful. So let me just put a fine point on that one. I was over in Taipei a couple of times during 2019, and I was asked by a couple of panel discussions with some retired government types, including military, and they asked me that question, and I said, "So, why are you buying Abrams tanks?" I can't get myself to that utility. Why are you starting your own submarine force at great cost? One of the things that would be provocative but interesting if Taiwan was serious about their own defense in a major combat operation would be to move to something like a Block 1A Army tactical missile system. It's got a unitary warhead. It's not nuclear. 300-kilometer missile would give them the ability to counter what is absolutely an overwhelming short and intermediate range ballistic missile capability by the PLA rocket forces, advanced sea mines. But again, and Gary knows this better than I do because he's lived there for a long period of time. And I've just done a couple of short site surveys. The vulnerability is, okay, so PLA puts SOF, into the southern portion of Taiwan. They roll up the coast, they weaken the coastal defenses, et cetera, et cetera. This is a tough call for Taiwan. And please ask them to not spend any more money on exquisite missile defense. Okay, exquisite BBs are a waste, especially when the other team has 1,200 missiles pointed at you.
So I'll just jump in on what I think is a widely held view in the Defense Department, that Taiwan needs to have a whole of society approach to its defense. And, Taiwan faces an enormous threat from China. And it's not just military, right? It's in the form of cyber attacks and economic and diplomatic pressure. And there are many examples of other countries that have been able to cultivate great public awareness and understanding of the threat, and to work together to signal the country that poses that threat, in this case China, of their willingness to fight for their freedoms, and doing that in a number of ways. And so, of course, Israel stands out as an excellent example. Some people also cite Singapore. I've heard people cite examples like Lithuania and Switzerland. I don't know if Taiwan has really studied these examples, but I fear that not only China may question whether Taiwan is determined to defend itself, but I've heard some Americans ask me the question, and others, whether they think that Taiwan would in fact defend itself and whether the Taiwan public would fight. So part of this is having an effective reserve or a national guard. And we know that today Taiwan does not have an effective reserve force. And so this is something that I think Taiwan needs to devote resources to. And frankly, in their military, in their Ministry of National Defense, there does not seem to be a great deal of support for modernizing and revamping these reserves and enabling them to have the capabilities that are necessary. So we hear President Tsai speak very eloquently about her commitment to creating an effective reserve force, but so far we just haven't seen it happen.
Thank you.
Can I add just a bit to that?
Please.
Okay, great. Those were great comments from both my fellow panelists. I would just kind of dovetail what Bonnie just said about the need to have a kind of a whole of society approach to the defense of Taiwan. If for it to be credible, I think that it would be absolutely essential to have that. I don't know. I guess my sense, after having lived there and been back many times since I was a grad student, I don't know that that's necessarily in place now. I know some people that I interacted with had made statements about their personal willingness to fight to the end and things like that, but I don't know how much it reflects a broader view across the society. I think much more could be done there. The only other thing I will say, I think that this has been a discussion for quite some time. I can remember, I think back during the Ma administration, they had a concept called they called it the hard rock, about being just a really tough defensive object or porcupine plan or poison pill or a bunch of different names for it, but just to be kind of a thing that would be very difficult for the PRC, the PLA to subjugate or to bend to their will, to make it an extremely tough counterinsurgency fight, or just that this would be not be a quick fight that would involve a rapid capitulation and so-called easy achievement of PRC objectives. I think that there's a place for that, but there's also a place for, possibly the development of additional and advanced space, cyber, and EW capabilities that could be asymmetric as well. And some of these things are probably taking place just out of public view, but I think that's how a lot of kind of weaker, less capable countries approach this, where you're not going to achieve conventional parity with a country like China, if you're Taiwan, but there's some of these other measures I think you can take to make it much more difficult. So there's a few thoughts.
Thank you. And I have to say, I especially appreciate the point that Bonnie raises about the lessons that Taiwan might learn from other small countries that have managed to achieve asymmetric deterrence of different kinds. And of course, the varieties of asymmetric deterrence that countries have achieved vary considerably, from Switzerland's citizenry under arms, who are of course assisted by geography, all the way to North Korea, which has achieved asymmetric deterrence through a nuclear capability. Which prompts me to ask a very explosive question from Dr. Harold Smith, which is simply this: do nuclear weapons play any role whatsoever in this discussion?
I hope not. Admiral Thomas, over to you.
Yeah, I want to use hope as a course of action on this one too, but it's absolutely a great question. I mean, especially when you look at Taiwan, they don't have to look very far to the successful deterrent effect of the Kim dynasty in North Korea to say, okay, this would, they would absolutely, forfeit so much goodwill internationally but you can kind of, connect the dots how they could get there. A scary proposition, but again, I think it's a great question and an absolutely interesting thought experiment.
And I suppose on that point, the analogy that Bonnie made to Israel is at least suggestive, because you have, in the Israeli case, a situation in which the United States pursued a policy more or less analogous to strategic ambiguity. No formal security guarantee to Israel was made. Indeed, no formal security guarantee to Israel has ever been made by the United States. So what in the end was the solution that Israel concocted to ensure regime survival? That solution was the nuclear facility at Dimona. And if you join the dots, there would be a plausible logic for Taiwan in enacting a similar kind of solution. What would be the consequences for cross-strait relations, just as a thought experiment?
I think, interestingly enough, if let's just suppose in somewhat of a wild-eyed perspective that Taiwan says, yep, we're going to take the lessons learned from Israel, which lives in a tough neighborhood, the DPRK, and so on, and we're going to go nuclear. Back to one of Bonnie's points originally. So what particular changes would force Xi Jinping to forego patience and then close the deal? And I think this would be one of those where, wait a minute, having nuclear weapons this close, this starts to look like a Cuban Missile Crisis, to Xi Jinping. And so I think action would be taken preemptively.
So I agree with that, but I would want to remind all of our listeners that Taiwan has twice tried to develop nuclear weapons, and twice the United States shut down their programs. I think the US would be aware of the fact that Taiwan had restarted a program, if it did, even before China knew. And I am certain that the United States would shut down that program again. So actually, the risks of war are usually less when the United States and China agree on the threat of an action that is posed by Taiwan. This is what we saw during the Transtravian era, because there was a referendum that was considered that China saw as provocative and the United States also thought was destabilizing. So in fact, the actions taken by Beijing and the United States served to control that potential crisis and prevent it from intensifying. And so I agree with you that if Taiwan did try to develop nuclear weapons, it could trigger a Chinese attack. But I think we wouldn't get there because I think the US would shut down the program.
Great, thank you. Gary, any final thoughts?
Just only this. I mean, I agree with what Bonnie and Admiral Thomas said on that. I think it'd be unnecessarily provocative for Taiwan to attempt that for a third time, for the US and for China. So, I just keep thinking as this discussion goes on about, I think it's a piece in the current New Yorker magazine, a long piece about North Korean cyber hacking capabilities. And I just keep thinking that, perhaps Taiwan could, obtain, something similar, the effects or the deterrent cross-domain capabilities through something like that, without having to go to the level of a actual nuclear weapons program that would be so provocative.
Great, thank you. Well, 1:30 is upon us, and we have a hard stop now. So all that remains is for me to thank our three panelists, Bonnie Glaser, Gary Sampson, and Robert Thomas, for a really illuminating conversation. I've learned an enormous amount from the three of you. I would just like briefly to acknowledge the sponsors of this event, the Institute of East Asian Studies, the Center for Chinese Studies, and the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office of San Francisco, and to remind our listeners out there that we will be hosting another event tomorrow. My colleague, Professor Susan Hyde of the Institute of International Studies, will be chairing a panel on democracy, authoritarianism, and geopolitics in East Asia, which will pick up on some of the issues that we've discussed today. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you especially to our panelists. This has been a great pleasure.